Have you ever wondered where you come from? Not just your family, not your last name, not your country, but something deeper, something older. Long before birth certificates, before borders, before Europe was ever carved into kingdoms and nations, the Bible quietly recorded the beginning of your story. A story written not just in history books or ancient ruins, but in scripture in names most people skip over and verses most never read aloud. Genesis tells us that after the great flood, when the earth had been wiped clean and humanity was given a second chance, Noah's 3 sons stepped off the ark and into destiny. And from one of them, Japheth, came the peoples of the north and the west. His name means expansion, multiplication, a spreading out. And indeed, from his sons and grandsons came nations, some that we now call Greek, Slavic, Celtic, Germanic. The building blocks of Europe carried on bloodlines no one remembers, but Scripture never forgot. Maybe you felt the pull before, that quiet urge to understand who you are and where you truly belong in God's greater design. Maybe you've looked at the world and wondered how such diversity ever came to be. The Bible doesn't just give us theology, it gives us origin. It gives us identity. It gives us purpose through lineages that trace back to a single moment when the world began again. This video isn't about politics or ancestry test. It's about rediscovering the sacred threads that connect entire civilizations to a promise made long ago. It's about what God recorded even when man forgot. Because hidden in Genesis 10, known as the Table of Nations, are the forgotten fathers of Europe. And if their names are in Scripture, they matter. So before we take the first step, pause, breathe. You didn't find this video by accident. Maybe there's something here for you. A piece of your story waiting to be remembered. Hit subscribe if you're ready to journey deeper. And stay with me, because what you're about to hear may change the way you see the Bible and yourself. Let's begin. From one blood, the sacred starting point. The Bible doesn't begin with nations, it begins with a garden. And from the dust of that garden, God formed the first man. Genesis 1:27 says, "So God created man in his own image. Male and female, he created them." This isn't just theology, it's identity. The first truth about you, before race, tribe, language, or culture, is that you were made in the image of God. And not just you, every person, every people, every nation. That's where the story begins, with one blood. But then came the flood, a cleansing, a judgment, a reset. The world was washed, and when the waters receded, only one family remained. Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. From these 8 souls, the world was repopulated. Genesis 9 and 10 make that clear. It's not a myth. It's the origin of all peoples, anchored in Scripture and echoed in the oral traditions of countless ancient cultures. Acts 17:26 puts it plainly. From one blood, he made all nations of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and has determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings. That verse alone holds more power than most realize. It means you're not random. Your ancestors weren't a mistake. The place you come from, the color of your skin, the shape of your language, it's all part of a divine plan. In a world that often feels fractured, this truth is unifying. We all come from one source. And yet, we didn't stay together. We didn't remain as one people with one culture and one tongue. We scattered, we adapted, we changed. But it didn't start with conflict. It started with a promise. The sons of Noah would each go in different directions. Each would carry a piece of that original calling to multiply, to fill the earth, to bear the image of God across mountains, rivers, islands, and empires yet to be born. Among these three, one would become the father of Europe and the West. His name was Japheth, and his story, mostly silent in the modern church, is about to unfold. Because once you understand who Japheth was and who his sons became, the map of Europe starts to look less like a political formation and more like a spiritual migration, a journey of nations traced back to a single name in the book of Genesis. But who was Japheth? What did his name mean? And why did his lineage shape the northern and western world? Let's trace that ancient path one step further. Japheth, the forgotten father of Europe. In many Bible studies, Japheth is barely a footnote. He's listed, he's named, and then the focus moves quickly to Shem, the line of Abraham, Israel, and Christ. But Japheth was not forgotten by God. In fact, his name may hold more than history, it may hold prophecy. Genesis 10 lists Japheth first among Noah's sons, perhaps as a signal of what would come. His name is often translated as expansion or enlargement, and that meaning reflects what unfolded in history. Ancient Jewish traditions interpreted Japheth as the progenitor of the northern peoples, those who spread across the isles and coasts, whose borders kept expanding like the waves they sailed across. But it wasn't just about geography. In Genesis 9:27, Noah blesses Japheth with these words, "May God enlarge Japheth, and may he dwell in the tents of Shem." It's a mysterious blessing part. Prediction, part promise. Enlargement implies vast influence, a growing presence. But to dwell in the tents of Shem suggests something deeper, a spiritual inheritance. Japheth's descendants would one day find a home in Shem's story. Some see in this a foreshadowing of the gospel when Gentile nations, many descended from Japheth, would find salvation through a Jewish Messiah. This intertwining of lineages, blessings, and spiritual destinies is not accidental. It's architectural. God was building a plan through bloodlines and boundaries, through tribes and time zones. Japheth's role was not to be the priestly line or the prophetic nation. His was to expand, to pioneer, to populate the edges of the known world, and in doing so, to prepare the nations for a greater redemption that would one day come from Shem's tent. And expand he did. The descendants of Japheth are traced across scripture and history, not with fanfare, but with precision. Genesis 10:2-5 lists 7 sons each, a name, but more than that, a root, a foundation. From these would come languages, cultures, empires, the Greeks, the Celts, the Germans, the Slavs, the Persians, the Romans. These weren't just political entities, they were people groups, ancient and distinct, yet united in origin. And yet many today have no idea that their European ancestry may trace back to a single name in a chapter they've never read. The story has been buried under centuries of war, migration, and change. But the Bible remembers. It always remembers. So who were these sons of Japheth? What cultures did they father? What legacies did they leave? And why does it matter today? To answer that, we need to look closer at the names in Genesis 10, not as a list, but as a living map of civilization. Because the sons of Japheth were not just ancestors, they were architects of the Western world. Let's meet them. The sons of Japheth naming the nations. Genesis 10:2 gives us a list many skim over. But beneath each name lies the seed of a nation, a people, a destiny. These aren't just ancient tribal markers. They're mileposts on the road from the Ark to the Alps, from Babel to Britannia. Japheth had 7 sons: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. Each one would become a father to regions and peoples that shaped the spiritual and political landscapes of Europe and beyond. Gomer is listed first, and history points to his descendants settling in areas near the Black Sea. Many scholars connect Gomer with the Cimmerians, an ancient people who lived in what is now southern Russia and Ukraine. As time passed, these groups migrated westward into what would become parts of Gaul and the British Isles. Celtic traditions, still preserved in Irish, Scottish, and Welsh lore, may very well trace back to Gomer's bloodline. Magog comes next, a name wrapped in prophetic mystery. In Ezekiel and Revelation, Magog is tied to end-time events, symbolizing a powerful northern nation. Historically, Magog is often linked to the Scythians, a fierce nomadic people known for their skill in horseback warfare. These tribes roamed the Eurasian steppes and eventually merged into what we now associate with Slavic roots: Russia, Ukraine, parts of the Balkans. These lands, so often in the headlines of today, may carry the legacy of Magog. Madai is the 3rd son, and here the biblical record intersects with known history. The Medes were a real and powerful people. Alongside the Persians, they formed the Medo-Persian Empire, one of the great powers in the book of Daniel. Though Madai's line is largely tied to the east, the Indo-European expansion theory suggests that groups related to Madai contributed culturally and linguistically to early European populations. Persian influence flowed west, leaving a mark that remains in art, language, and legend. Javan is perhaps the most clearly identified. He is the father of the Greeks. The name Javan is considered equivalent to the Ionians, one of the major Greek tribes. The sons of Javan, listed later as Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim, are tied to key locations in the Mediterranean. Through Javan, we find the roots of Western philosophy, early democratic thought, and classical civilization. This isn't speculation. It's a direct line between Genesis and Athens, between ancient scripture and the foundations of Western society. Tubal and Meshech are frequently mentioned together in scripture, often in prophetic contexts. Historically, these names have been connected to early tribes in the regions around the Caucasus Mountains and Asia Minor areas that now touch modern-day Turkey, Georgia, and southern Russia. Later traditions even tied them to the rise of Slavic and Eastern European nations. Their names echo in Ezekiel's prophecies, suggesting not only ancient settlement, but future significance. Tiras, the final son, is the most mysterious. Some traditions connect him to the Thracians, an Indo-European people who lived in southeastern Europe, including parts of Bulgaria, Romania, and Greece. The Thracians were known for their warrior culture, music, and poetry. Though often overshadowed by Greeks and Romans, they left a distinct mark on Europe's early cultural fabric. Through these 7 names, a pattern emerges. From the coastal regions of Greece and Cyprus, to the forests of Germany, to the steppes of Russia, to the shores of Spain, the sons of Japheth scattered and settled. They shaped languages, they built kingdoms. They wove the tapestry of Europe not randomly, but by divine design. Yet these ancient names were never meant to be just historical. They still whisper today, in flags, in dialects, in borders drawn and redrawn, and in prophecy not yet fulfilled. Because the Bible doesn't just describe the past, it prepares us for what's ahead. So let's zoom in even further. One of Japheth's sons, Javan, fathered more than just Greece. His descendants branched into the very heart of Mediterranean identity. And when we follow those lines, the map of ancient Europe begins to glow with biblical names we thought were long forgotten. Let's explore them. Javan and the Mediterranean legacy. Among all the sons of Japheth, Javan stands out not just because his identity is more clearly traced, but because his descendants played a central role in shaping the cultural and spiritual soul of the Western world. Genesis 10:4 names Javan's sons Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Dodanim. These are more than obscure biblical names. They are ancient doorways leading us to Greece, Spain, Cyprus, and the lands of the sea. Javan is widely understood by biblical scholars to be the father of the Ionians, one of the principal Greek tribes. The name Javan is so closely tied to the Greek people that in Hebrew Javan is still the word for Greece today. This connection isn't speculation, it's linguistic and historical continuity. The Greeks, known for their philosophy, architecture, and mythologies, are not absent from the biblical story. In fact, they're part of its foundation. Javan's son, Elisha, is believed to be the progenitor of early Greek settlements, particularly around the Peloponnese and Aegean regions. Ancient sources, including early Jewish interpretations, associate Elisha with the Hellas region, the root of Hellenistic. Some even suggest that the name Elisha may be an ancient form of Hellas itself, indicating a direct biblical tie to the people who would shape much of Western civilization. Then there's Tarshish, a name that echoes through prophecy and poetry. Tarshish was known as a distant, wealthy trading port. Some traditions place it in southern Spain, others near modern-day Sardinia. Wherever it was, it symbolized far-off abundance. In Isaiah 66 and Ezekiel 27, Tarshish is mentioned as a place of silver, iron, tin, and lead. If Elisha ties Javan to the Greek heartland, Tarshish pushes that legacy westward to the Iberian Peninsula, to maritime trade, to the early seeds of what would become Spain and Portugal. Kittim, another of Javan's sons, is associated with the island of Cyprus. Ancient historians and biblical texts often refer to Cyprus as the land of Kittim. This island, positioned between Greece and the Near East, was a vital crossroads for early commerce, culture, and conquest. The Kittim were known for their seafaring, and the term is even used prophetically in Daniel to refer to Western invaders, possibly the Greeks or Romans, once again linking Javan's line to future movements on the world stage. The last son, Dodanim, also recorded as Rodanim in some versions, is thought to be connected to the island of Rhodes, or possibly even the Dardanians, ancestors of the ancient Trojans. Though debated, this connection is powerful. It places the descendants of Javan not just in Greece proper, but in the broader network of Aegean and Anatolian peoples who played crucial roles in myth migration and war. The Trojan War, so central to Western epic and identity, may have biblical roots deeper than we realize. But these are not just ancient geography lessons, they're revelations. They show us that the Mediterranean basin, a region so often seen as secular, mythological, or philosophical, has deep ties to the sacred. The Bible did not ignore these cultures. It included them, named them, placed them in the origin story of mankind. And by doing so, God reminded us that no nation rises outside His view. No culture develops without His permission. Even the seafarers, the warriors, the philosophers, they too were sons of Javan, sons of Japheth, sons of Noah. Today, when we think of Western civilization, we think of marble columns, Olympic Games, and Plato's dialogues. But Scripture pulls back the curtain and says, before there was Athens, there was Javan. Before there were ships, there were sons. So what happens when we follow the other sons not just across the Aegean, but deeper into Europe? Because Javan's brothers, Gomer, Ashkenaz, Ripath, and others, didn't build temples. They carved forests. They roamed mountains. They forged tribal paths that would eventually become Germany, France, Ireland, and beyond. Let's journey there next. Because hidden in those ancient names are the roots of the West, Ashkenaz, Ripath, and the rise of the West. While Javan's line hugged the coastlines of the Mediterranean, shaping the seas with philosophy and trade, another path was forming, one that moved inland through forests and over rivers into the heart of what we now call Western and Central Europe. That path begins with Gomer, another son of Japheth, and continues through his sons Ashkenaz, Ripath, and Togarmah. The name Ashkenaz might sound familiar, and it should. Even today, the term Ashkenazi Jews refers to Jewish communities historically centered in Germany, Eastern Europe, and the Rhineland. But long before that cultural designation, Ashkenaz was a man, a grandson of Noah, whose name would come to define an entire region and people group. According to ancient Jewish tradition and the writings of the Talmud, Ashkenaz became associated with the northern regions of Europe, especially the lands around the Rhine and Danube rivers. This means that many of the early Germanic tribes, those who would one day form the backbone of nations like Germany, Austria, and parts of Switzerland, may trace their spiritual roots back to Ashkenaz, the son of Gomer. His name, carried through centuries, became synonymous with the cold, forested lands of the Northlands that would later birth kings, reformations, and revolutions. But Ashkenaz wasn't alone. Ripath, another son of Gomer, is far less discussed, but ancient interpretations suggest he is connected to the Celtic peoples tribes that once dominated Western Europe, from Gaul, modern-day France, to Britannia and Hibernia, Ireland. The Celts were known for their mysticism, oral tradition, and warrior culture. And while they left few written records, their legacy survives in the rhythms of Irish folklore, the structure of early European tribal society, and even in the ancient laws that shaped medieval kingdoms. Some traditions hold that Ripath settled in the western reaches of the continent, his descendants becoming the ancient Gauls, Britons, and Scots. If true, this places Ripath as a foundational figure in the story of the British Isles, a forgotten patriarch whose name still whispers beneath the stones of old cathedrals and windswept highlands. Togarmah, though not mentioned in this section of Genesis, is elsewhere associated with Armenian, Georgian, and Anatolian peoples groups that would eventually link the European and Asian worlds through the Caucasus Mountains. While not directly tied to modern Western Europe, Togarmah's line represents the bridge, the threshold between the West and the East, where culture, trade, and faith would one day collide. These names, Ashkenaz, Ripath, Togarmah, are not static relics. They are living roots, roots that stretch beneath cathedrals, castles, and cities we walk through today. They tie together the tribes that became nations, the dialects that became languages, the families that became dynasties. But what's more striking is how these biblical identities reveal a profound unity within the European story. Whether Germanic, Celtic, or Slavic, these lineages all begin at the same place, the ark, the mountain, the moment after the flood. And from there they moved outward, not randomly, but in patterns of providence. Like the Israelites wandering toward a promise, these sons of Gomer journeyed toward lands they would one day claim as home. They brought with them not just tools or weapons, but divine legacy. Even in their forgotten state, they carried a name, a name that still matters. And if the line of Gomer stretched westward, another line, another cluster of Japheth's sons was headed north and east, toward the vast steppe, toward prophecy, toward the shadows of Magog. That path takes us into the realm of scattered tribes and end-time warnings. And it begins with names most have only heard in whispers: Meshech, Tubal, and Magog. Let's walk that ancient trail, the Tower of the Tongues and the Dispersion. It's one of the most mysterious and misunderstood moments in Scripture. Genesis 11 tells us that after the flood, humanity was united. One people, one language, one purpose. And with that unity, they began to build. Not a temple, a tower. The Tower of Babel was more than just bricks and ambition. It was humanity's first great act of spiritual defiance after the flood, a monument not to God's name, but to their own. Genesis 11:4 records their words: "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves, and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But scattered they were, because the Lord saw what they were building, not just in stone but in pride, and he came down. Not with fire or flood this time, but with language. A simple act, a divine fracture. Suddenly, people couldn't understand one another. Confusion reigned. The builders stopped. The tower stood incomplete. And the world was never the same. This moment wasn't just about construction. It was about calling. God had commanded Noah's sons to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, Genesis 9:1. But instead of filling it, they clustered. Instead of spreading, they built upward. They wanted unity, without obedience, progress, without purpose. And so God intervened not to punish, but to fulfill his original design. The result was dispersion. From Babel, families scattered. And as they went, their tongues shifted. Words turned strange. Dialects were born. Languages took shape. Culture followed. And soon what began as a single voice became a global chorus, echoing through forests, across rivers, over mountains. But here's what's easy to miss. Babel wasn't the origin of division. It was the origin of diversity. God didn't divide to destroy. He diversified to create. Europe, with all its tongues, Latin, Germanic, Slavic, Celtic, Greek, finds its roots not just in migration, but in mandate. The variety we see today, the deep cultural differences between a Norwegian and a Greek, a Spaniard and a Russian, are not accidents of evolution. They're echoes of Babel. They're the outworking of a single divine interruption meant to scatter humanity across the canvas of the earth. Even the very sound of Europe, its languages remind us of that moment. And yet within this dispersion is a thread of hope. Because even though people were scattered, the divine image remained. Every tribe, every tongue still bore the imprint of their Creator. Babel may have changed their speech, but not their source. From one blood, they still came. Today we marvel at Europe's richness, its cultures, its cuisines, its languages. But the Bible whispers, it began at Babel. It began with a tower that wasn't finished and a plan that could not be stopped. But there's more. Because this dispersion didn't just create languages. It forced people into new lands, new climates, new challenges. And as they moved outward, their bodies began to adapt. Their skin changed. Their shapes changed. The environment began to press in. And God in his providence allowed humanity to become as varied in appearance as they were in language. What does that tell us about divine intention, about beauty, about the uniqueness of nations? That's where we go next, into the lands where people settled, and into the bodies shaped by God's environment. Because diversity wasn't just about language, it became something we could see, something we still see. And it too has a purpose, identity, and divine design. As families scattered from Babel and drifted across the earth, they didn't just carry new languages, they stepped into entirely new worlds. Mountains, deserts, islands, tundras. From the windswept plains of the Slavic north to the sun-drenched coasts of the Mediterranean, every climate imposed a challenge. And over generations, people began to change, not in essence, but in form. Job 12:10 declares, "In his hand is the life of every creature and the breath of all mankind." That one truth reframes everything. The variations we see across nations and ethnicities, skin tones, features, body types, aren't mistakes or accidents. They are fingerprints of providence. God, through the tools of adaptation, shaped each people group to survive and thrive in the lands he assigned them. In equatorial zones like Africa, rich melanin protected against intense sunlight. But in regions like Northern Europe, where sunlight is scarce, lighter skin allowed for more efficient vitamin D production. This shift passed down through generations wasn't evolution. In chaos, it was divine engineering, a response to need built into the very body. The same patterns emerge in stature, bone structure, and even facial features. Populations in colder climates develop shorter limbs and broader chests for heat conservation, while those in warmer zones retained leaner frames to stay cool. Every change tells a story not of superiority, but of survival, of placement, of God's wisdom written into biology. And still, despite all these differences, we return to one foundational truth: we come from one blood, one Creator, one global family. In a world consumed by division, the Bible offers a deeper lens, one where identity is sacred, diversity is intentional, and every people group carries part of the image of God. So the next time you see a face unlike your own, or perhaps look into the mirror wondering about your own roots, remember this: you were shaped for where you were sent. And your design is not random. It is evidence of divine care. Because God's plan wasn't just about dispersion, it was about preparation. And now, with all these scattered peoples shaped by climate culture and centuries, what happens next? What does it all mean? Why did God go to such lengths to diversify, to disperse, to assign nations their time and place? To answer that, we must step back and reflect not only on the past, but on the spiritual design behind it. In the end, the story of Europe isn't just about nations or names, it's about design, a sacred design. From the sons of Japheth came tribes and empires, languages and legends. But beneath the shifting borders and cultural markers lies something older, deeper, and divine. It's the truth that God appointed not only the rise of nations, but the time and place in which each would dwell. And within that tapestry, you exist not by chance, but by purpose. If you've ever felt lost in the vastness of history, unsure of where you belong in the bigger picture, remember this: your lineage, whatever it may be, is not a footnote. It is a thread in the fabric God began weaving at the dawn of humanity. You were not born into this generation, this land, this story by accident. The book of Acts reminds us that God determined the times and boundaries of every nation, and that includes yours. So what does this mystery reveal? It tells us that God is not distant from the story of humanity. He is the author. And his fingerprints are not only on the spiritual moments, but on the historical ones too. He shaped bodies for climates, languages for cultures, and peoples for purposes. He scattered so that one day, through Christ, he might gather again. The diversity of Europe and of the world is not a sign of division. It is evidence of a Creator who delights in variety and who calls each nation back to him in its own voice, its own story, its own way. Thank you for walking this path with us. If this journey sparked something in you, if it stirred a question, a memory, a longing, don't let it fade. Like, share, and subscribe to join us as we continue to uncover the mysteries the Bible has quietly preserved for generations. You're part of this unfolding story, and there is so much more ahead. Until then, may the God who scattered the nations also gather your heart. May you walk in the knowledge that you are seen, known, and placed by design. We'll see you soon for the next mystery revealed.